Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
Welcome everybody to our Really American broadcast. This is that's not every day we do it, but you can find us. And if you've been following us on Twitter, you know exactly what we're up to. Joining me right now is from the Pacific Legal Foundation is Anastasia Boden, who is she is a senior litigator. I don't know if she's a litigator, but she challenges anti-competitive licensing laws, and she is a litigator. She's nodding her head towards me. Good to have you here, Anastasia. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Chip.
All right, so let's just jump right off. I wanted to talk to you today because I was thinking about this during the football playoffs. Right, I wanted to bet on a game, but I can't bet online in California. I have to call a friend in Vegas to do it because California wants to protect me from myself. And I understand, you know, the problems with gambling, and a lot of people have a lot of big problems with it, but it bothered me and it got me thinking of you, and it got me thinking about this question of the government versus us versus I, and where we go with that. So let's start with one that I've been talking to with a few of my colleagues at first, and that it would be this California decision to force corporations to have a woman on their board of directors. Where does that stand right now?
Yeah, so there have been a few lawsuits challenging this, and the funny thing about suing the government, which is what I do for a living, is it's kind of unfortunate that they never want to just earnestly defend their laws. It's like you have a law on the books, You're trying to coerce us all into, doing what you want us to do. Why can't you just come into court and defend the law? But they don't. They play all of these games. And so we brought a lawsuit about 2 years ago, and we still haven't even gotten to the merits of it because there's all these procedural games being played. It took us just a year and a half to even get a court to say that our client had what's called standing, that he was even the proper plaintiff to bring a lawsuit. We had a fight about that for a year and a half. But in any event, we recently asked a federal court to immediately stop the law because it was going to have its effect at the annual shareholder election and force shareholders to vote on the basis of immutable characteristics. And the judge said no, he wasn't going to stop the law from going into effect immediately. But he said, hey, I'll see you at trial, get all the evidence you can, and we can talk about it, some months from now. So the quest goes on.
All right, let's back up. First of all, is California unique in that way, or are there a lot of other states that unilaterally make decisions on behalf of their people without involving the legislature?
Yeah, this is the first state to pass a mandatory quota. Many states have passed non-binding resolutions where they encourage corporations to elect more women or more racial minorities. But California is the first nation to require it by law.
What is it? How does it actually stand in California right now?
Right now, by law, corporations are required to hire a minimum number of women and a minimum number of people from, quote, underrepresented communities, which means racial minority communities or sexual minorities, or they face fines, $100,000 per seat that's not filled by a person with the appropriate background.
Pacific Legal Foundation is a quasi-libertarian, and I say quasi because you guys don't smoke pot all day. But I say a libertarian think tank, kind of, for lack of a better word, right? And attorneys who go to bat for, during the shutdown, during the pandemic, you represented some businesses that believe that they should be allowed to open and do business. But let me just do this because I know I don't know if it was Aristotle or Socrates, but there's this ridiculum ad absurdum where I'm going to take your position and I'm going to go to the opposite end. And let's take restaurants that don't want African Americans to eat there. Okay. They'll have a sign up, no blacks allowed. All right. Then another restaurant obviously has the option to say, we welcome everybody. And that restaurant that says no blacks allowed in most places in this country would lose business and be forced to shut down. But you don't go that far, right? You don't say that, that again, there are laws, federal laws that prohibit that. And states have to abide by them. But that's the far extreme. So you believe that obviously, if a state does not enact those laws, that's a place where the court should step in, and that these protections under the federal government are important. One might say sacrosanct. Would you agree, starting at that level and moving from that?
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with you that racism and discrimination is abhorrent and that it is prohibited by civil rights laws. And we don't challenge those civil rights laws. We just think that these laws actually mandate what is in effect discrimination, and that is making choices on the basis of race or sex.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because obviously as we've seen that protected list grow bigger and bigger over time. There are some groups that are excluded, like people that are overweight, that have to, that can't, are allowed, they have to buy an extra seat on an airplane. And you look at these, situations, and this is not easy, right? Some of this stuff, some of it may seem real easy and straightforward, especially to you guys. And I don't disagree with a lot of that. I think that one of the arguments or conversations we had during the pandemic was, should Gavin Newsom or governors in especially blue or red states, really, for that matter, should they have the kind of authority to override the legislature or ignore the legislature and move forward with mandates that have not been determined to been, I don't know if legal is the right word, but the will of the people of that state. How do you determine what issue falls into what category? I mentioned, race and, creed and sexual orientation. How do we do that? How do we figure out when a legislature has to be involved, or when a governor or a president can make these decisions?
Yeah, well, I think part of this is inherent in when you get the government in the business of doling out benefits and burdens on the basis of characteristics. And when they're playing this sort of numbers game, when they're saying, hey, we want more of this kind of background and fewer of that kind of background. Anytime the government gets involved in that, you're going to start getting some really tricky questions about who should be involved and who shouldn't. And it kind of points to what kind of an ugly business this whole thing is. And we saw this actually in Illinois. So after California passed its woman quota, now it has also an underrepresented community quota, but it started out as just a woman quota. That's how they dipped their feet in the water. And after that, Illinois tried to pass a minority quota, but it only included a quota for African Americans. And what happened is that bill actually stalled throughout the legislative process because the different caucuses started fighting over who should also get a spot on the board. And they started infighting and saying, no, you don't deserve a seat. I deserve a seat, more seats for my group, fewer seats for your group. And I think it just points to exactly why we have constitutional protections against this, because it's a very ugly business when you start saying who deserves a seat based on something like a characteristic that they were born into, that they have no control over at all. This isn't about getting rid of discrimination. It's about playing this equal numbers game. And I think that's always going to bring up sort of the questions that you ask.
Since George Floyd's death, obviously, race has been front and center more than it ever has. In fact, I was kind of surprised when Biden said that his death had a greater impact than the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which I disagree with. But, you go down this road and you start to say, and this is where I find myself leaning toward your position, in that when we establish quotas, when we establish aspects of affirmative action that seem draconian, then we get away from the real problem. And the real problem is America's cities and education and environment, everything from asthma for children in these apartment buildings because of bugs and cockroach feces and all. I mean, it's right. You go down that rabbit hole and you realize, there is systemic racism in this country, even if it's not being directed by a singular person. Nonetheless, you have people, and poor people too. I mean, the vast majority of people in this country on welfare are white, and many of them live in these red states. So I guess the question is, I remember Keynes said, when confronted with Adam Smith's invisible hand, he said, yeah, but in the long run, we'll all be dead. We got to get something done now. How do you balance the need for action right now from a quotas and that to the long picture where this should be done in our society? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. The funny thing is, I think out of all of the options at hand, quotas are the worst thing to do right now, the worst method of getting at injustices, because there's such a sloppy tool for remedying real instances of injustice that we might care about. And in the process, they affirmatively require people to make election decisions at shareholder elections on the basis of race or sex. It creates this sort of divide in society. It creates resentment. It perpetuates stereotypes about the benefited groups, because now people start thinking that people only got to the boardroom based on getting a leg up. And if you look at the way California has litigated this case, that sort of plays out, right? Like with regards to the woman quota, they've said during discovery, we asked them, what's the purpose? Why did you choose this number of women? Why the quota? And they said, well, it's because women really bring something special to the boardroom. They're more risk averse than men, and they're more likely to follow the law, and they keep men in line. And, all of these kind of pernicious stereotypes about women. And so I really think that of all the things that we should be doing, if you want to act now, this is the last thing we should be doing. But I agree with you that there's certainly a lot of other things that are going on that create disparities that affect particular communities in a disparate manner, and that's something that we should go after.
Obviously, I mean, again, you look at the long-term implications of quotas don't really address the problem, and it gets some people off the hook, right? And whether it's housing, whether it's redlining, whether it's education. I mean, it's when you go into some of these schools and you see 40 kids in a class and there's 30 books and the teachers change every year because they're always looking for a better job. You realize that this is generational. And the irony for me, for conservatives in that regard, is these are people that, given the right opportunities and right circumstances, would be exactly what they want. Americans that can contribute in every possible way that a working American can contribute. Um, yeah, I look at it's interesting too, because conservatives decry social media. They want more conservatives in social media, or conservatives in media, mainstream media, they call it. You would disagree with forcing that, right? You'd say this has to happen. It's the buyer beware, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think that I'm consistent on these issues, that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and that in order to be consistent, we have to say we protect individual liberty, we protect the free market, regardless if it leads to the outcomes that we might personally prefer. And like you said, at least with regards to the quota, and with a lot of facets of society, there's so much plaguing our society that we're missing when we look to these short-term solutions. Like you said, schooling, there's a real problem there. I mean, we might disagree about how to go about fixing that, but for me, certainly, I think that there should be better choice, and that's education problems are plaguing minority communities at a disproportionate rate. Housing, let's make housing affordable. Again, we might disagree about how to get there, but that's a better goal, I think, than a simple numbers game. And certainly with regards to economic opportunity, we are locking so many people out of jobs. And I think the biggest perpetuator of that is actually the government itself, with the crazy licensure laws, the anti-competitive regulations that are on the books at the behest of incumbent businesses. These laws are not there to protect the public. In fact, there's plenty of studies showing how much red tape does not lead to better quality. They're there to protect people from competition. They're there to drive up the cost of going into business and to keep people from competing. Small businesses, small entrepreneurs. So let's get rid of that stuff and give people a real chance, meaningful opportunity, rather than going for short-term gains like quotas.
Talking to Anastasia Boden, who is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, and you started the education talks. Now I got to finish that. I want to go down that road. So let me get this straight. If I'm a taxpayer and I live in an affluent area, can I say I don't want to pay taxes for public schools? I want to send my kid to a Catholic school or a private school, and I should be able to pull my taxes out that are going to that. I remember reading early Cato Institute, Reason Magazine stuff about let's privatize the highways. So, because, and it's kind of what they want to do with insurance right now, on how much you drive. That road eventually leads again to a disproportionate amount of income not being directed toward people who really need this in this collective society. And we are not a democracy. We are a republic. Let's go back up to that and just say, so what do we say to a taxpayer that says, I'm going to take my taxes out of the public school systems and pay for my own?
I mean, I don't even think that you have to go that far to really get somewhere. We can say, okay, fine, everyone has to pay taxes. You don't get to not
Cherry
pay.
pick. Yeah.
But I think we would be much better off by just giving people more choice over where they went. So even if people could choose within their community, or choose to exit their community and go to another public school, at least create choice among public schools. That would do wonders for driving the poorer performing schools out of business, and allowing people to escape failing schools, allowing children who really need this opportunity the most and are being harmed the most, just to get out of those failing schools, but we lock them in. And I think that's a real problem.
But isn't the answer to just create a better school system? And, I know that, I've heard this argument about teachers' unions and how they protect bad teachers. Seen a lot of evidence of that, but I've heard that argument. And then I look at schools that underperform, and in many cases, in this country, they still don't have internet access. They don't have the right books. We have states like Texas, cherry picking evolution versus whatever they call their creationist theory, which is, it's insane. There's absolutely no science behind it. It's kind of like what we're dealing right now with some aspects of COVID. If I live in a state like Texas and my kid goes to a public school, and again, because the state has a legislature that is, we've talked about this before. One of my problems with having Newsom consult Sacramento during the pandemic was these people that are in the House and the Senate in these states, they live in small communities and they got threatened. Public health workers were threatened. The same thing happens in schools. I think the reason Youngkin won in Virginia was because McAuliffe was such a horrible candidate and said parents shouldn't have any control over their kids' education, which is crazy. These are complex issues that when you go through it all, if you have to look at I or us or the government's done a pretty good job over the years in providing for these essential things for our society to thrive and prosper. Look at the country. I mean, we've done really well. Wouldn't it make more sense, instead of picking these apart brick by brick, to strengthen them up?
Well, I think it's sort of addition by subtraction in a lot of ways. That there's a lot of waste, that there's a lot of barriers that is called protectionist. It's there to purportedly help us all, but actually does us all a disservice. And so, I think what I can agree with you with is that sometimes everyone seems to lose sight of how lucky we are. I always like to remind people when they're complaining about, the next big thing that they're complaining about in America, that we are so lucky to live where we are, that we have it really good, and that our standard of living is actually quite high. So that's fair. But in terms of making it even better, I'm also glad to say that I agree with you that we both have the same intentions, right? Like, I don't like when we demonize the other side and think that people are outright evil. Nobody's evil. I think generally people want the same things. They just believe in a different way to get there. And I think that eliminating barriers to entry, creating more private options, allowing people to either exit their local failing school for another public school, or to use that money that they would otherwise be using at that public school to go to a private school, I think that would be the way to build up our country, rather than just, creating more failing schools.
But those taxes, if people start pulling their money out of public schools, inevitably the people with no money are hurt. I mean, we are a great country, but we do fall behind many countries in the world in education, maternity, health, just you go down the list. I mean, just education, if you look at performance, again, that's a complicated issue, but and you can't lay it all on teachers. But again, it goes back to my original issue. You look in these areas where the performance is low, there are a lot of factors that tell me that something has to be done. I read Wealth of Nations, right? I also read The Theory of Moral Benefits, I believe it was the name of it, that Adam Smith wrote as well. And I think to myself that if we don't have a safety net of sorts to stop people from falling through, confidence in our system and our way of government will ultimately suffer. I don't know where we are right now, but we're definitely not a confident nation. We are polarized because of the very issues you and I are talking about, the role of government in our lives, and the responsibilities that we have as individuals to be a part of that. I mean, right? Other than voting, how many people listening to this right now have any experience in helping government function better, or communities, or again, just many things, as you said, that are private, that do good jobs. I mean, I'm an atheist, but I love what the Catholic Church does and what Christian charities do. So I support them, right? I support them because I'm pragmatic. Let's go back again and to our the subject that brought us together here, and that is the idea of trying to fix a social wrong. What responsibility does government have when they know that women have been denied through the glass ceiling has been broken through, but then the next day they call in the ceiling repair company? Well, where do we stand there, and how do we fix something that is with 51% of our population being women, and they're not making a significant impact in corporate boardrooms? How do we fix that?
Yeah, a couple thoughts, but I will just say, going back about this school thing, I tend to think that poor students actually tend to be the biggest beneficiaries of more choice because it's them who are able to leave the failing schools. So that's my true belief. But we can argue all day about
Does
that.
that
But getting
happen? I mean, I don't know. I mean, what do the numbers say?
I think that if you look at the studies related to school choice, they go to show that the biggest beneficiaries are the poorest communities, and that it leads to better performing schools. But I'm not an expert on school choice, so I shouldn't.
Well, that's cool. I mean, we have obviously a lot of people jump in on this. Public schools are failing because they've been undermined and underfunded for years on purpose by the right wing. I can't speak to whether or not it was on purpose, but it does seem to me that obviously, if schools are funded by the government, and when a Republican government comes in and they cut taxes for corporations, but then the Trump administration was maybe not fair for Republicans to look at. But when you look at in the past under Bush and before under his father, you saw funding being cut for the arts, and rich people can afford to put their kids in the arts. Poor families can. When you talk about cutting back funding for education in the states based on what the states tell the federal government they need. If a state says we're fine, but the people aren't fine, doesn't the federal government have a right to protect the rights of the students in those states to get an education? Isn't education in healthcare, are those fundamental rights?
Well, it depends on what you mean by
access to quality.
I think, well, let's put it this way. Getting back to the subject at issue, because there is a bit of pragmatism here, right? Like I don't even argue for my own core libertarian beliefs. I just go into the court of law and ask that the government be reasonable and abide by constitutional limits. And I think on that end, there's a lot more that could be done right here, and particularly when it comes to helping women in the workplace. You said, does the government have a responsibility to go in and help females if it thinks that women aren't making the progress that they should be? But I would argue that this goes to show exactly what the problem with this quota, and that is that it is perpetuating the stereotype that women aren't making it in the workplace, when if you look at the numbers, women were doing really darn well. 42% of open board seats were going to women prior to this quota going into effect. That's nearly half of board seats, when women are graduating from MBA programs at lower rates than men. So, this is pretty good, this 42%. But because we have this quota on the books, now everybody thinks women aren't able to get there without government help. They think every woman who's hired under the quota only made it there because of the quota. I mean, this is not helping women. This is doing a disservice to women. And I think that's because the government has gone from a purely remedial stance, like it used to say that we're trying to remedy past discrimination, into a numbers game, an equal numbers game. And I don't think that's what the government should be in the business of. It should be in the business of getting rid of discrimination, allowing people to have opportunity to reach their potential, and then let the chips fall where they are. But when it tries to, get rid of people of one race or one sex and sort of finagle the numbers around, I think they're really doing a disservice to the people that they're purportedly trying to help.
We talk about the government like it's this robot entity, when in fact the government is us, right? I mean, it's people. One of my favorite quotes, Scalia used to say, not my favorite justice, but I do appreciate him, and the fact that Ginsburg got along with him, and I really appreciated her point of view, told me that he was more than you see on the surface. He once said, sometimes it's my job to tell the majority to take a hike. And I don't know if that comes from a strict constructionist view of our Constitution, or just, again, populism, the idea that, if enough people agree let's be honest, democracy at its core is mob rule, right? We created a government to protect the rights of people that are left behind, not to protect the minority, but to protect the majority of people who don't make up that significant number of people who, we have in the Bay Area, I think there's I want to say there's 1,000 billionaires in the Silicon Valley area, in that area. And that's insane, right? How can that be? You look at this and you say to yourself, I know that when you go back to, trying to provide for people who have been squeezed or left out, there's a question there. And the question is, do we do them more harm by helping them? or are we better off creating an environment in which they can thrive? I think the second part, in theory, is wonderful. But honestly, how close is this nation to doing that for people that have been left behind? Everybody from, let's go back 200 years and say Native Americans who we forced to live on reservations, to African Americans who, after the Rutherford Tilden election, Jim Crow set in, and to many, you look at what prompted Black Lives Matters to stand up and say, look, this is, before video cameras, before everybody had a phone, this was always happening. Doesn't the government have a responsibility to fix what the government didn't fix when they had an opportunity?
Yeah, I think this is a far cry from something like a safety net or some meaningful step trying to help people.
Why?
This is virtue signaling. I mean, the governor said it was. The governor said when he signed the woman quota, this is probably unconstitutional, but I'm signing it to, quote, send a message about the way that California feels about women. I don't think it's a meaningful step towards changing the status of women in the workplace. I think, in fact, I think it's detrimental to women, and also I think again it's the worst way to go about it. I mean, you should not, the way, as Justice Roberts, I believe, once said, the way to get rid of discrimination is to get rid of discrimination. It's not to perpetuate discrimination under, false pretenses, under good intentions.
Well, we all discriminate. I mean, you discriminate on Match.com. You discriminate with friends, and it's not unconstitutional or illegal or immoral to make decisions, right? But when those decisions deny people access to constitutionally provided rights, and even more, push the Constitution away, things that they've put in. I love the way we talk about the undocumented, like they're animals roaming the streets. They're a big part of this nation's, especially California's economy and this nation's economy. I've read, might have been a CBO, but if we could push these 11 to 15 million, or as Ann Coulter says, 40 million undocumented out of the country, our GDP would drop 3 to 5%. I mean, so, and obviously that's a very difficult thing, right? We'd love people to come here legally. And I'm only saying that in that, this is, again, the government is a lot of people with a lot of disparate views. And it's something that we all should be more a part of, but we're not. And I don't know if what we're living and experiencing right now with social media is helping it or making it worse. I tend to be an optimist and think that eventually communication will bring us all closer together. I love what the Pacific Legal Foundation represents in theory and mostly in practice. I just think that there's, like I go back to, again, that I don't know where that phrase "ridiculum ad absurdum" comes from. It's a Latin phrase, but I think if you break things down to their most basic point, they seem stupid, but you do it sometimes to make a point. And that point is that, everybody in this country should have equal rights and access to, what the government provides. And it just doesn't seem to be that way. And I'm curious, when I see state governments kind of, do what Newsom said, and Newsom says some stupid things, and that was a stupid thing to say. This is probably unconstitutional. Somebody else said that too, famously. I can't remember if it was the ACA or something else along those lines. But I mean, this is a kind of conversation that should have alcohol and take weeks, right? I mean, we're not going to solve this in a 40-minute podcast. But I wonder, how do we get that message to people out there that we're not forgetting them?
Yeah, well, I think it's by pairing, at least on my end of it, it's by pairing the message of equality that, hey, this is not the kind of equality we're looking for. I think this is discrimination under another name. We don't want any benefits, no burdens on the basis of immutable characteristics, with a message of opportunity. So I think it's not good enough anymore to just say, hey, we're anti that policy. We're anti, affirmative action in the boardroom. I think you have to also couple that with a message of saying, we want opportunity for everyone. We want to get rid of barriers that keep people down, and reminding people of that. I think it's also by showing people how dangerous this numbers game is, by showing how it's permeating other parts of society, like public schools. To get back to schools, where literally public schools are now throwing out their admissions criteria, that they're race neutral, just testing criteria, because they say that there's too many people of one race there. And I'm not talking about whites. They're saying there's too many Asians in certain schools, and they don't like that. So they want to kick out Asian students. So they get new admissions criteria in order to get the balance that they prefer. This is an ugly business. We were just in court today arguing this. We have a lawsuit in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson School, which has done this very thing. And the text messages reveal that this was exactly their motivation. This is an ugly business. We want equal treatment, no benefits, no burdens, and we want opportunity for everyone. And I think that's a positive message that everyone needs to hear.
Do you see the Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee movie?
No.
In African American communities across this nation, not so much now, but in the last 30 years, you'd see oftentimes a Korean family come in and open a business in an area where other business had failed, and there were maybe empty buildings, and the family would work it. You'd have 7 or 8 kids, and they would work it, and they would make it successful. Because it's a family, because they're first generation Americans. I saw this when I worked in DC, when Nigerians came over and drove cabs. They drive 12, 14-hour shifts because they were just so happy to be in the United States and to have this opportunity. I think that, we see these stories and we run them up the flagpole as examples of what America can and maybe should be. I just think that, that message is not getting to, again, I look at a community like in Baltimore where I worked. West Baltimore had 10,000 boarded up homes, 10,000, right? You saw The Wire. You've probably seen The Wire before. I mean, that shit was real, and that was frightening. And, so people say, well, I remember people telling me, well, they should just move. Well, my cousins and my grandparents and my family all live around here. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go out to the suburbs where I can't get a job out there. I'm going to move into a white neighborhood in the suburbs. And I'm not even going to say it's racism. It's more about an economic Sisyphus. I mean, every time it seems like we're going to get that that rock over the top, we don't. It falls back, and this has been going on since Jim Crow, and now it's an economic Jim Crow in essence, and that we're just letting it continue. I mean, we would all benefit. The nation would benefit if we, and I say we, I mean the government, went into these cities and enacted programs that encourage businesses to come back. Instead of giving them a 35 to 21% tax cut in the federal government, we should say, look, you go in and you do this, then we'll give you the tax cut. We do it backwards. So, I mean, I don't know how we fix these grand systemic problems with, a cheerleading episode or a banner across a plane saying, pick yourself up. What did King say? That, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you have no boots. I mean, do you see that point? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know that we're ever going to agree about this, Chip. But to my mind, the thing that has brought so many people here, that has lured people here, the thing that immigrants appreciate about the United States, the thing that has made this country great, has been entrepreneurship and the free market. And to the extent that we make it easier for people to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, I think that benefits everyone. I think that, the free market has done so much good in terms of lifting people up in the longevity of life, the standard of living, access to medicine. I think more of that, getting rid of government barriers. Some of the biggest injustices that have been done, and in particular towards racial minorities, has been by the government, because they hold, a monopoly.
Give me an example. Can you give me one off the top of your head?
Oh, well, zoning. I mean, zoning has been a tragedy throughout history. The way that they've used zoning laws to keep racial minorities in the poorest areas, to segregate communities. I think zoning has been a travesty. Occupation.
I'm not sure I understand how that works. Can you explain that to me? How does zoning stop African American families in Baltimore from starting businesses, or getting better education, or avoiding, the rampant crime? I mean,
Yes, there has been a long and I think undisputed history of zoning being very intentionally wielded against racial communities to uh, keep basically communities segregated. So when we see, and even to this day, I think it's a wrong-headed policy to have single-family homes rather than allowing higher population density. They'll say, well, that's because we want our community to look a certain way in terms of what the homes look like. But what it really did was it made it more expensive to live in that community, and it kept poor populations, and in many cases, racial minority populations out of these communities. It really wasn't about what the house looked like. It was about what the family inside looked like, and their socioeconomic status. And so I think that's been a tragedy. And the same thing with occupational licensing. We know that a lot of these laws on the books, particularly in the area of transportation, that has a really pernicious history, where keeping people out of jobs for the big established owners of certain races. These laws are very often unequally enforced. Where there's a law, it's going to be unequally enforced against the people who have the least ability to protect themselves and that are
Yeah.
already in prison. So I think that's been a huge way of killing jobs and a way of keeping people of fewer means down. Those are just two. I mean, I could
Sure.
go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm the one that broadened this thing from the original thing. And I enjoy the opportunity to talk about it because I really think that a discussion about these important issues, on whether it's, if you watch MSNBC, you get a real strong angle. If you watch Fox, you get the exact opposite. Somewhere in between is the breeding ground for, great ideas and action. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's any money in it. And that's the problem. Seriously, right? The money is in polarization and creating clans and sides. And that's a huge problem. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, all I want to do this weekend is bet on the games without having to call my friend in Vegas and have him run down to Caesars and make a bet for me. It's insane, right? I don't need another mommy. And that's that, again, I understand that people have problems with gambling. We can talk about that forever, right? And that's a real classic example right now that people in this state of California would go, okay, I agree. I should be able to do that. It's a good place to start. Unfortunately, we're going to finish there, and let's do it again. Okay.
Sounds great.
No, I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and thank you so much. And we'll stay in touch. All right.
Always good to chat. Thanks, Chip.
All right. Bye-bye now. Again, that is Anastasia Boden, and it was nice enough to join us here to talk about, what is the whole idea of the economy versus individual rights, our nation's progress. Does it interfere with, do we all move along at the same speed? And that's something, obviously, we all have to figure out. Anyway, thanks, you guys. This is another Really American Broadcast. I'm Chip Franklin. You can follow me on Twitter at Chip Franklin. I'll be posting a video in just a few minutes talking about Dan Crenshaw and his telling a 10-year-old girl at a recent rally, "Don't question my faith." Yeah, wait to hear about this one. Anyway, you guys be well. We'll talk to you soon. Again, thanks to Anastasia Boden from the Pacific Legal Foundation. And